I'm still his wife.
Simone Carter spent 4 years planning a wedding day she would never finish. She had chosen the flowers herself, the same white peonies her grandmother once carried, and she had rehearsed her vows in the mirror so many times that she no longer needed the paper folded inside her bouquet. What she had not rehearsed for, what no bride ever rehearses for, was the sound of the chapel doors opening halfway through her own ceremony, and a woman she had never met walking down the aisle with a little girl's hand wrapped tightly around hers. 300 guests turned in their seats at once. Julian Vance, the man Simone had just promised her life to, went pale before a single word was spoken. The woman's name was Renata Voss, and within seconds of stepping into that chapel, she would say the one sentence that changed everything Simone thought she knew about the man standing beside her. She did not shout, she did not cry. She simply looked at the officiant, then at Julian, then at the little girl beside her, and said that she was still, legally, his wife. For a long moment, nobody in that room moved. Simone stood in her gown with her bouquet still in her hands, watching her mother, Patricia Carter, go white in the front row in a way that suggested this was not, for her, entirely a surprise. What happened in the minutes after that sentence is not what most people expect, and it is not what Julian Vance's family expected either. Because Simone did not run, she did not collapse into the arms of her bridesmaids or scream at the man in front of her. She stood perfectly still, looked directly at Renata Voss, and asked her a single question, quiet enough that only the first 2 rows could hear it, but sharp enough that Louise Vance, Julian's mother, visibly flinched from where she sat. That question would unravel a secret that had been protected inside the Vance family for years, one that involved a marriage nobody dissolved, a payment nobody was supposed to trace, and a brother, Dean Vance, who had been waiting a very long time for a moment exactly like this one. This is the story of a wedding that never technically happened, a mother who chose silence over honesty, and a bride who walked into her own ceremony believing she knew the man she loved, only to discover that the truth had been sitting in a locked drawer the entire time. Before this day was over, 3 people in that chapel would learn secrets about each other that had been buried for years, and one of them would leave with far more power than anyone in that room believed she had. Stay with us, because what Simone Carter uncovers next will change the way you think about every perfect wedding you have ever watched from the outside. Before we go further, here are the questions this story will answer. Was Julian Vance ever truly free to marry Simone in the first place? How much did Patricia Carter actually know before she watched her daughter walk down that aisle? And who benefits the most from a secret that was always going to come out eventually, whether it happened that day or 10 years later? Some of the people in this story were protecting themselves. Some were protecting each other, and at least one of them had been planning this exact moment for far longer than anyone in that chapel could have guessed. To understand how a wedding ends like this, you have to go back to the beginning, long before Simone Carter ever heard the name Renata Voss, back to the first time she met Julian Vance and believed, the way most people do, that she was simply falling in love. Simone met Julian at a charity gala 2 years before the wedding, the kind of event where her marketing firm had a table near the back and his family's company had an entire ballroom named after them. She noticed him before he noticed her, standing off to the side of the room instead of in the center of it, which struck her as unusual for a man whose last name was printed on half the buildings downtown. He introduced himself without mentioning the Vance name at all, and by the time she found out who he really was, 3 weeks had already passed, and she had already decided she liked him for reasons that had nothing to do with his family's money. That distinction would matter more than she could have known. For the first year, everything about the relationship felt uncomplicated in a way Simone had never experienced before. Julian was attentive, funny in a dry, understated way, and quick to make her feel like the most interesting person in any room they walked into together. He remembered small details, the name of her childhood dog, The exact coffee order she gave once and never repeated. The anniversary of her father's passing. Friends told her she had found something rare, and for a long time she believed them completely. Patricia Carter liked him immediately, though there was one detail she noticed early on that she chose not to press. Whenever the conversation drifted toward Julian's 20s, toward where he had lived before joining the family business full-time, he would answer in general terms and then steer the conversation somewhere else entirely. Patricia assumed it was simply a man who did not enjoy talking about himself. She would later admit that assumption cost her more than she expected. The Vance family itself was not an easy one to marry into, and Simone understood that from the beginning. Louise Vance had built the family's hospitality and real estate holdings into a regional empire after her husband's death, taking a company that nearly folded during a difficult recession and turning it into something that employed hundreds of people across 3 states. She ran the company, and in many ways the family, with the same discipline she had used to keep the business alive during those years. She was not cold, exactly, but she was precise, and she measured almost every decision, personal or professional, against what it might cost the family name. Simone admired that about her at first. It would take a long time before she understood how far Louise was willing to go to protect that name. Julian's older brother, Dean Vance, had once been positioned to take over everything. He had grown up being told, in ways subtle and not so subtle, that the company would eventually be his, and for most of his 20s he shaped his entire life around that expectation. That changed several years before Simone ever entered the picture, after a business decision involving one of the company's hotel developments went badly wrong. The project ran over budget, a key investor pulled out, and the fallout landed squarely on Dean. Fairly or not, Louise quietly began shifting control and expectation toward Julian instead. And though nobody in the family said it out loud at first, everyone understood what had happened. Dean stayed in the family. He kept showing up to dinners and holidays and company events, always polite, always present, but something in him had gone cold, and very few people ever asked him why, least of all Julian, who had simply stepped into the space his brother left behind without ever fully reckoning with what that meant. The engagement itself came the way Simone had always imagined it would, at the restaurant where they had their first real date, with a small velvet box and a room full of strangers who applauded when she said yes. Patricia cried, the good kind of crying, and told her daughter that night that Julian looked at her the way Simone's father used to look at Patricia before he passed. It was one of the warmest nights of Simone's life, and it was also, though she did not know it yet, the same week that Louise Vance made a phone call to an account she had been managing quietly for over a decade, one connected to a name that had not been spoken inside the Vance family in years. Louise hung up that call, straightened the papers on her desk, and told herself, as she had told herself many times before, that the matter was handled. Wedding planning consumed the next 14 months, and Simone poured herself into every detail, the flowers, the venue, the guest list that eventually reached 300 names. She loved this part more than she expected to, the spreadsheets and vendor calls and seating charts, the small satisfaction of watching a complicated plan come together piece by piece. There were small, strange moments during that stretch that she would only understand the significance of much later. A wire transfer on a joint account statement, made out to an entity called RV Holdings, that Julian brushed off as a business expense when she asked. Delivered with just enough ease that she didn't think to push further. A night 2 months before the wedding, when Dean Vance pulled her aside at a family dinner, away from the noise of the table, and told her, in a tone she couldn't quite place at the time, that she deserved to know exactly what she was marrying into. She had laughed it off as Dean being Dean, the brother everyone in the family had quietly learned to keep at arm's length. She would think about that comment constantly in the weeks that followed her wedding day. Renata Voss had a story of her own, one that began long before Simone Carter ever entered Julian's life. She met Julian 9 years earlier, when he was 24, and still years away from taking any real role in the family business, when he was simply a young man who worked weekends at a restaurant near her apartment and made her laugh in a way nobody else did at the time. They married quickly, the way young couples sometimes do, in a small courthouse ceremony with 2 witnesses and no family present. For almost a year, it was a genuinely happy marriage. Then Louise Vance found out. Louise did not approve, and she made her position clear within weeks of learning about the marriage. Renata was not, in Louise's words, someone suited to carry the Vance name into the next generation of the company, and she made it known to Julian, gently at first and then with increasing pressure, that his future depended on resolving the situation. Julian, young and unwilling to lose the life his mother was offering him, eventually agreed. Renata was paid a settlement to leave quietly, to sign paperwork she barely read, and to disappear from the family's life entirely. She left believing, as Julian did, that the marriage would be formally dissolved shortly after. Neither of them ever confirmed it. Renata discovered she was pregnant with Ivy only after the arrangement was already finalized, and by then, reaching back out felt impossible. For 9 years, Renata built a life on her own terms, raising Ivy largely without support from Julian or the Vance family, working long hours to keep a small apartment and a stable routine for her daughter. The quarterly payments from RV Holdings continued throughout those years, framed in the paperwork as a settlement rather than child support, though everyone involved understood exactly what it was covering. It was only in the months before the wedding, after Renata lost her job and found herself struggling in a way she hadn't in years, that she reached out to the Vance family directly, asking not for more money, but for acknowledgement, for some form of stability for her daughter, beyond a quarterly transfer from a company she had never been allowed to name aloud. She was turned away by an assistant who never even let the request reach Louise's desk. It was around that same time that Dean Vance, working a separate angle entirely, found her. Dean had learned, through an old contact who still had access to the company's legal files, that the divorce between Julian and Renata had never been formally finalized, that the paperwork Renata signed years earlier had covered a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement, but never actually completed the legal dissolution of the marriage itself. He recognized immediately what that meant, and more importantly, he recognized the timing. His brother was 3 months from a wedding that would be broadcast to 300 guests, and by extension, to every business partner and rival his mother had spent decades cultivating relationships with. Dean found Renata's address within a week. He did not tell her everything at once. He simply confirmed a few details, offered a small amount of financial help with no strings attached, and waited to see whether she would eventually put the pieces together on her own. She did. 3 days before the ceremony, Julian received a text message late at night that made him leave the room to answer it. Simone asked who it was the next morning, and he told her it was a vendor issue with the caterer, nothing worth worrying about. What she did not know was that the message had come from Renata Voss, who had finally learned the exact date and venue of the wedding, and who had spent that entire night deciding what she was going to do with that information. Julian spent the following 2 days trying to reach her by phone, offering increasingly larger sums to stay away, growing more desperate with every unanswered call. He never told his mother what was happening. He never told Simone. He simply hoped, the way people often hope when they have avoided a problem for too long, that it would somehow resolve itself before anyone had to find out. The morning of the wedding, Simone woke up feeling the particular calm that comes right before something enormous, though she assumed the enormous thing was simply the ceremony itself. Her hair and makeup team arrived at 7. Her bridesmaids brought mimosas she barely touched, and by the time she put on her dress, she felt more certain about her choice than she had felt about almost anything in her life. She remembers standing in front of the mirror, her mother fixing the back of her veil, and thinking that this was the beginning of the easiest, happiest chapter of her life. 3 rooms away, Julian sat alone in a suit he could barely focus on buttoning, still trying Renata's number every few minutes, watching each call go straight to voicemail. By 10 that morning, Julian had accepted that Renata was not going to answer, and he made a decision that would define how this entire story was later understood by everyone involved. He decided to proceed with the ceremony anyway, gambling that she would not actually show up, that the threat was simply leverage, a negotiating tactic rather than a genuine intention. He told himself this repeatedly as guests filled the chapel, as his mother adjusted his boutonniere and told him how proud she was, as his brother Dean stood beside him at the altar with an expression Julian mistook for nervousness rather than anticipation. What Julian did not know was that Dean had confirmed the venue address to Renata just 2 nights earlier, and that she was, at that very moment, less than a mile away, sitting in her car in a parking lot with her daughter in the back seat, deciding whether or not to go through with it. The ceremony began the way every wedding begins, with music and quiet anticipation, and 300 people rising to their feet as Simone walked down the aisle in a dress her mother had cried over twice already that day. The vows started smoothly. Julian's voice caught slightly on one line, which everyone assumed was emotion. Halfway through the officiant's remarks, the chapel doors opened at the back of the room, and Renata Voss walked in with her daughter Ivy, holding tightly to her hand. She did not rush. She walked at a pace that made it clear she had rehearsed this moment more than once in her mind, past rows of guests who had no idea who she was, past floral arrangements that had cost more than she made in a month. By the time she reached the 3rd row, every guest in that chapel understood that something had gone deeply wrong, even before a single word was spoken aloud. Renata stopped a few feet from the altar, looked directly at the officiant, and said that she could not, in good conscience, let this ceremony continue, because she was still married to the man standing at the front of that room. The words landed like a physical blow across the entire chapel. Louise Vance's face drained of color in the front row. Patricia Carter grabbed the arm of the woman beside her, without seeming to realize she had done it. Julian opened his mouth to respond, and produced nothing at all. No denial, no explanation, just silence, which in that moment told the room almost as much as a confession would have. Simone stood perfectly still at the altar, her bouquet still in her hands, watching the man she loved fail to say a single word in his own defense, watching 300 faces turn from her to him and back again, waiting for someone to say something that made sense. What Simone did next surprised everyone in that chapel, including the people who had known her longest. She did not run. She did not cry, at least not yet. She turned to Renata Voss and asked, in a voice steady enough to carry through the silent room, whether the marriage had ever actually been legally dissolved, or whether it had simply been assumed to be over. It was a strange question for a bride in that position to ask, precise and almost clinical, and it revealed something about Simone that very few people in that room had ever seen before. A habit, learned through years of managing complicated projects professionally, of reaching for facts before feelings, whenever the ground beneath her started to shift. Renata answered honestly. As far as she knew, no divorce had ever been finalized. Somewhere, buried in a filing cabinet or a forgotten drawer, the paperwork had simply never been completed. The reception hall never opened that day. Instead, the Vance and Carter families retreated into a back office of the venue, the kind of room meant for vendor meetings and last-minute logistics, now filled with the 2 families and the wreckage of what should have been a celebration. Guests were quietly asked to leave, the caterers were sent home with untouched trays, and the string quartet packed away their instruments without ever playing the reception set they had rehearsed. Simone still wore her wedding dress as she sat across from Julian, demanding an explanation, and what she received instead were fragments, half-truths, delivered slowly, as though the full picture was too heavy for him to hand over all at once. Yes, he had married Renata 9 years earlier. Yes, his mother had pressured him to end it once the family business began to grow. He had believed, he insisted, that the legal side of things had been handled. He had never checked. It was Patricia Carter's reaction, more than Julian's, that told Simone the real story went deeper than one man's carelessness. Her mother would not meet her eyes. When Simone asked, directly, whether Patricia had known anything about this before today, there was a pause just long enough to answer the question on its own, before a single word was said. Patricia admitted, quietly, that Louise Vance had approached her privately, over a year earlier, before the engagement had even been announced publicly, and had told her enough to raise concern, along with an assurance that the matter had been fully resolved years before Simone ever entered the picture. Patricia had accepted that assurance, and along with it, an amount of money framed as a wedding gift, meant, she said, to help give her daughter the life she deserved. Simone sat with that information for a long moment, staring at her own mother in a dress she had spent months helping her choose, before she spoke again. Louise Vance, for her part, said very little that first day. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, offering only clipped, careful responses, the same instinct that had guided her through decades of protecting the family business, now guiding her through the collapse of her son's wedding. She insisted repeatedly that everything had been handled years earlier, that Renata's reappearance was some kind of manipulation, possibly orchestrated for money, and she looked pointedly at Dean when she said it, though at the time, nobody in the room understood why. Dean, standing near the door with his arms crossed, said almost nothing. He offered his brother a brief, hollow apology for the chaos of the day and left before anyone could ask him a single direct question. It would be days before Simone understood exactly how much that silence was hiding. Over the following days, Simone did something almost nobody in her position does. Instead of disappearing to grieve the wedding that never happened, she began investigating it, methodically, the way she approached every difficult project in her professional life. She reached out to a lawyer friend to understand exactly what an undissolved marriage meant, for the ceremony that had just collapsed in front of 300 witnesses, learning quickly that in the eyes of the law, she and Julian had never actually been married at all, regardless of the vows spoken or the dress she was still hanging in her closet, still zipped in its garment bag, untouched. She pulled old bank statements and found the wire transfers to RV Holdings going back years, far more of them, and far larger, than the one she had noticed during wedding planning. She began to understand that Louise Vance had not simply paid Renata Voss once to disappear. She had been managing the arrangement quietly for nearly a decade, keeping Renata financially dependent and distant, and apparently believing that distance alone was the same thing as a legal resolution. Simone drove to see Renata directly, a conversation nobody in the Vance family expected, and one that Julian actively tried to talk her out of. What she found, sitting across a small kitchen table from a woman she had every reason to resent, was not the calculating figure Louise had described. Renata spoke plainly about the years she had spent raising Ivy largely alone, about the quiet shame of accepting quarterly payments from a family that would not acknowledge her daughter existed, about reaching out months earlier only to be turned away without ever speaking to anyone who mattered. She had not walked into that chapel to destroy a wedding out of spite. She had walked in because she was finally, after 9 years, done being an inconvenience that got managed from a distance. Simone left that conversation with far more sympathy for Renata than for the man she had almost married. For a while, the investigation pointed almost entirely toward Louise, and it was easy to understand why. She was the one who controlled the money, the one who had approached Patricia with reassurances that turned out to be false, the one who had clearly known about Renata's continued existence in Julian's life for years. Simone spent several days convinced that Louise alone had orchestrated the wedding day collapse, perhaps even allowing it to happen deliberately, some theorized, as a way of finally forcing Julian to confront a mistake she had never let him fully take responsibility for. It was a compelling theory, and for a short time it was the one Simone believed most. But a detail kept surfacing that did not fit neatly into that theory at all. Renata had not simply shown up at the wedding on her own. Someone had told her the date, the venue, the exact hour of the ceremony, information she should not have had any easy way to access, since she had been deliberately kept at a distance from the family for nearly a decade. When Simone finally traced a string of text messages on Renata's phone, with Renata's own cooperation, offered freely once she understood Simone was not there to punish her further, the name attached to those messages was not Louise Vance at all. It was Dean. Weeks of quiet contact, small offers of help, careful questions about what Renata knew and what she wanted, all leading, deliberately, toward a single date circled on a calendar that had nothing to do with generosity and everything to do with timing. Dean Vance had spent years watching his younger brother inherit the future that once belonged to him, watching Louise slowly transfer trust, responsibility, and eventually control toward Julian after the failed hotel project that had cost Dean his place at the head of the family. He had stayed quiet about it for a long time, showing up to family dinners with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, attending company events where his own name had quietly disappeared from the leadership materials over the years. But when he learned, through an old business contact, that Renata Voss and Julian's marriage had never been formally dissolved, he saw an opportunity that had nothing to do with protecting Simone and everything to do with dismantling the version of his family that had left him behind. He found Renata. He gave her the details, slowly, patiently, never pushing too hard, letting her arrive at the decision on her own timeline. And he waited, for months, for the exact moment when the damage would be impossible to contain. The full shape of the truth came together during a single, tense conversation in Louise Vance's home office, 2 weeks after the wedding that never finished. Simone arrived with copies of the bank statements, the legal findings from her attorney, and the text messages Renata had shared with her, and she laid them across Louise's desk without saying a word at first, letting the older woman look through them herself. Louise finally admitted what she had spent nearly a decade avoiding. She had paid Renata to leave Julian's life shortly after their marriage began, believing at the time that a formal divorce would follow shortly after. She had never confirmed that it did. As the years passed and the payments continued, quietly folded into other business expenses under names that meant nothing to anyone reviewing the accounts, she convinced herself that the arrangement was simply insurance, a way of keeping a complicated chapter of Julian's past safely out of sight, rather than a legal obligation she was actively failing to resolve. She had never told Julian the divorce might not be finalized, because admitting that would have meant admitting she had let an unresolved legal marriage sit untouched for years, rather than risk the conversation required to fix it properly. It was easier, she said, to manage the problem quietly than to confront it directly, a philosophy that had worked for her in business for decades and that she had simply applied, without fully realizing it, to her own family. When Simone asked whether Louise had known about Dean's involvement, the older woman went silent for a long moment, and then admitted that she had suspected it almost immediately after the wedding collapsed, recognizing her older son's fingerprints on the timing even before any proof existed. She had chosen not to say anything, she admitted, because doing so would have meant reckoning with exactly how deep the fractures in her family had grown, and exactly how much of that fracture she herself had caused. Julian, for his part, insisted he had genuinely believed the matter was settled, that his mother had told him years earlier it was handled, and that he had simply never had a reason to question it. He described, haltingly, the panic of the 3 days before the wedding, the calls to Renata that went unanswered, the decision to proceed anyway rather than face the possibility of losing everything he had built with Simone. Whether that was the full truth or a convenient version of it, even Simone found herself unable to fully determine, and in some ways, she realized, it no longer mattered. A man who marries without confirming he is legally free to do so, and who avoids the topic of his own past for years rather than simply resolving it, bears responsibility regardless of what his mother did or did not tell him. Simone had spent 2 years believing she understood exactly who Julian Vance was. She now understood that she had only ever seen the version of him that was convenient to show her. What almost nobody in that room expected, not Julian, not Louise, not even Patricia, was what Simone revealed next. Months earlier, during wedding planning, she had noticed enough small inconsistencies, the deflected questions about his 20s, the wire transfer she was never given a straight answer about, Dean's strange comment at that family dinner, to feel a quiet unease she couldn't fully explain at the time. Rather than confront Julian directly and risk a conflict she wasn't prepared to win, she had quietly asked her own attorney to review and strengthen her prenuptial agreement months before the wedding, ensuring that regardless of what she eventually discovered about the Vance family's finances or history, her own financial future would remain entirely protected. She had not known exactly what she would find. She had simply learned, long before that wedding day, not to build her entire security around someone else's version of the truth, a lesson she credited, quietly, to watching her own mother rebuild a life after her father's death, with far less preparation than she deserved. In the weeks that followed, each person at the center of this story moved forward into a version of their life none of them had expected. Simone did not stay to fight for the marriage, and she did not need anyone's permission to walk away from it. She left the Vance family's business dealings behind entirely, kept the protections she had quietly built for herself months in advance, and began rebuilding a life that, for the first time in 2 years, belonged entirely to her own decisions, rather than someone else's carefully managed story. She returned to her career with a renewed intensity, and friends who saw her in the months afterward described someone who seemed, strangely, more grounded than before the wedding, as though the collapse of that day had clarified something in her that 2 years of a comfortable relationship never had. Louise Vance faced the difficult task of explaining nearly a decade of concealment to a family business built on public trust, and while the company itself survived the scandal, the version of Louise who emerged from it was noticeably different, more willing, those close to her said, to have the difficult conversations she had spent years avoiding. Dean Vance got the reckoning he had engineered, though not the outcome he had hoped for. Rather than restoring his standing within the family, the fallout confirmed for everyone, including Louise, that he could not be trusted with the responsibility he had once believed was owed to him. And the distance between him and the rest of the family only grew wider in the months that followed. Renata Voss, finally free of an arrangement that had kept her isolated for years, began the slow process of establishing a stable, independent life for herself and her daughter Ivy, this time without a quarterly payment attached to her silence. What this story leaves behind is not a simple villain and a simple victim, but a family that mistook silence for protection, and a woman who understood, long before anyone else in that chapel did, that the only person she could fully rely on to protect her future was herself. Was Louise Vance protecting her son, or protecting the business that bore her name? Was Patricia Carter's silence really about her daughter's happiness, or about accepting an easier version of a difficult truth? And was Simone Carter simply a bride who was blindsided, or a woman who saw more of the picture than anyone around her realized, and quietly prepared for it long before the doors of that chapel ever opened? We would love to know what you think. Would you have spotted the warning signs before the wedding day, or only after? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.